Coffee spilled across the linoleum, a muddy brown puddle inching toward Chanel's tires. Nobody noticed. They were too busy staring at the giant of a man in the doorway and the scarred Belgian Malinois at his hip. A dog that was about to break every rule in the room. Fluorescent lights hummed above, emitting a sickly, greenish hue that made the hospital cafeteria look like a morgue with a salad bar. Chanel sat in the far back corner. It was her designated spot, not by official decree but by the unspoken social contract of able-bodied people who didn't know where to look when they saw a 30-year-old woman in a titanium wheelchair. She liked the corner. Her back was flush against the cold cinder-block wall. She had a clear view of the double doors. More importantly, it kept the pity miles away. She peeled apart her turkey sandwich. The bread felt like damp cardboard and smelled vaguely of industrial bleach, effectively masking the scent of boiled carrots lingering from the hot food line. Chanel took a bite, chewed mechanically, and dug her knuckles into the numb expanse of her right thigh. 4 years since the drunk driver. 4 years of people tilting their heads, softening their voices, treating her like cracked glass that had been glued back together. It exhausted her. She didn't want inspiration. She wanted a decent meal in silence. Rain lashed against the large plate-glass windows. A Tuesday in November. Miserable, bone-chilling weather. The double doors of the cafeteria shoved open, letting in a gust of freezing wind and the sharp scent of wet asphalt. Chanel didn't look up at first. She was busy scraping a layer of unidentifiable mayonnaise off her meat. But a sudden, unnatural dip in the ambient noise forced her attention. The usual clatter of cheap metal forks against ceramic plates faltered. The squeak of rubber-soled nursing shoes stopped. A man stood in the entryway. He dripped water onto the grey linoleum. He didn't look like a patient, nor did he look like a doctor. He looked like a localized storm front. Tall, broad-shouldered, but hunched inward, instinctively guarding his center mass. He wore a faded olive-drab jacket, soaked through at the shoulders, clinging to him like a second skin. Water beaded in his dark, closely cropped hair. His eyes, pale, restless, exhausted, flicked across the room in a jagged, mechanical rhythm. Threat assessment. Chanel knew the look. She worked in the VA recovery wing 2 floors up. This guy was fresh out of something dark, and the jagged red scar cutting through his left eyebrow confirmed it. At his left side stood a dog, not a golden retriever in a cute, brightly colored vest. This was a Belgian Malinois, lean, corded with dense muscle, wrapped in a black tactical harness loaded with utility pouches and a heavy-duty grab handle. The dog's coat was a wet, dark fawn. A thick, raised strip of hairless skin disrupted the fur along its ribs. Shrapnel, Chanel guessed. The animal stood perfectly still, eyes locked forward, leaning slightly against the man's leg. Chanel watched him walk. His gait was uneven, favoring his right leg, a heavy, punishing limp that ground his heel into the floorboards. He moved toward the coffee station. The crowd parted for him. It wasn't out of respect. It was out of primal, uncomfortable instinct. The man radiated a tense, coiled energy, like a snapped power line whipping around on wet concrete. He poured a black coffee. No sugar, no milk. He didn't even bother to grab a plastic lid. He just took the steaming paper cup and turned around. His eyes locked onto Chanel's corner. She stiffened, her hand freezing halfway to her mouth with the ruined sandwich. There were at least a dozen empty tables. Tables near the windows, tables near the entrance, tables far away from the cynical nurse whose legs didn't work. He walked straight toward her. The heavy rubber soles of his boots squeaked against the wet floor. The Malinois moved in lockstep, its nails clicking. Tick, 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 a rhythmic metronome of military discipline. As he got closer, The sensory details hit Chanel in waves. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, burnt coffee, and the distinctly metallic, sour tang of old adrenaline. Up close, his face was worse than she initially thought. Greyish skin drawn too tight over sharp cheekbones. Deep, bruised shadows under his eyes, hollowed out by days, maybe weeks of sleeplessness. He stopped at her table. Chanel stared at him. She didn't offer a polite, accommodating smile. She was completely out of smiles. She gripped the cold aluminum push rims of her chair, bracing herself. She hated the invasion of her perimeter. She resented his assumption that he could just claim her space. Yet the clinical part of her brain, the nurse, noted the pale nail beds on his free hand and the slight, involuntary tremor in his jaw. "Can I sit here?" His voice was gravelly, low. It barely carried over the hum of the vending machines. Chanel frowned. She looked at the perfectly good, empty tables to her left. She looked back at him. "There's a whole room, buddy." "I know." He didn't explain. He didn't offer a sad, apologetic story or a charming grin to disarm her. He just stood there, holding his coffee, his knuckles white around the flimsy paper cup. His eyes darted to the window, then back to the space behind Chanel's head, the solid cinder block wall. He needed the wall at his back. He needed to see the exits. He was trapped in a war zone that didn't exist here. Chanel swallowed her irritation. Her jaw unclenched. She recognized a fellow ghost when she saw one. "Fine," she muttered, shifting her plastic tray a few inches to the right. "Knock yourself out." He pulled out the chair opposite her. It scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh grating sound that made Chanel wince. He sat down heavily. A ragged breath escaped him, barely audible, slipping out through gritted teeth. He placed his coffee on the table. "Down," he whispered. It wasn't a command yelled across a park. It was a micro-vibration in the air. The Malinois immediately folded its hind legs, preparing to slide under the small table. Standard protocol. Out of sight, out of the way. But that wasn't what happened. The cafeteria retained its muted, strained atmosphere. People at adjacent tables pretended to eat, stealing covert glances at the giant, battered man and the dangerous-looking dog. Chanel went back to her sandwich, determined to ignore the heavy, suffocating presence across from her. She picked at the crust, feeling the crumbly, dry texture against her thumb. Underneath the table, a sudden shift in weight vibrated through the floorboards. Chanel's titanium footplates rattled. She pulled her knees back instinctively, though she couldn't feel the physical movement below her waist. The heavy scrape of dog claws against linoleum echoed from beneath the plastic tabletop. "Brutus, stay!" The man hissed. His voice held a sudden, sharp edge of panic. The dog ignored him. A large, wedge-shaped head emerged from under the table, but not on the man's side. Brutus stepped out into the narrow aisle separating Chanel's table from the next. The dog didn't sit. He didn't lie down. He stood squarely in the open space, his broad chest blocking the walkway completely. An orderly pushing a cart of dirty trays stopped dead in his tracks. The cart wheels squeaked in loud protest. Excuse me," the orderly mumbled, staring nervously at the animal. Brutus didn't look at the orderly. His dark, intelligent eyes were fixed entirely on Chanel. "Hey!" the man barked, reaching down to grab the short, braided handle on the dog's tactical vest. "Brutus, heel." The dog planted his paws. He dropped his center of gravity, turning himself into 70 pounds of immovable muscle and bone. The heavy leather leash went taut. The man pulled. His jaw clenched, a fresh bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. The knuckles on his scarred hand turned stark white. Chanel watched, her heart hammering a sudden, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't afraid of dogs, but this animal was a weapon. She could see the scars. She could see the sheer explosive power coiled in its hindquarters. "What is he doing?" Chanel asked, her voice tight. She kept her hands flat on the table, hyper-aware of her own vulnerability. He doesn't do this!" the man stammered. The cool, hyper-vigilant operator from 2 minutes ago was fracturing right in front of her. His breath hitched. He pulled harder on the harness. "Brutus, what's wrong with you? Heel!" Instead of retreating, Brutus took one step closer to Chanel. The cafeteria went dead silent. The hum of the vending machine compressor seemed to amplify in the quiet. The orderly with the tray cart slowly backed away. Every eye in the room pivoted to the corner. The silence was thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable. Chanel hated it. She hated being the center of attention. Her cheeks burned with a sudden flush of angry heat. She was the paralyzed girl again, the spectacle. "Get him under control!" Chanel snapped, her cynical shell hardening to protect her. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want an audience of pitying eyes. "I'm trying!" the man growled through gritted teeth. His hand shook. A violent, uncontrollable tremor ran down his forearm. He wasn't just struggling with the dog. He was struggling with his own crumbling nervous system. The caffeine, the adrenaline, the sheer exhaustion. It was all culminating in this tiny public rebellion. He's trained. He's a Tier 1. He doesn't disobey. Brutus took another step. He was now flush against the side of Chanel's wheelchair. Chanel recoiled, pressing her spine hard against the vinyl backrest. The dog was massive. Up close, he smelled of damp earth, wet canvas, and crushed pine needles. Heat radiated from his dark fur, a furnace of living, breathing intensity right against her skin. Then Brutus did the unthinkable. He didn't sniff her. He didn't lick her hand. He lowered his massive, scarred head, bypassed the metal armrest of her chair, and laid his chin directly across Chanel's paralyzed thighs. The impact was heavy. It pressed down on her legs with the weight of an anvil. Even through the neurological dead zone, the deep, phantom nerve endings in Chanel's spine registered the sudden, immense pressure. A strange buzzing sensation, like static on an old television, spread across her lap. "No, no, no!" the man gasped. He dropped his coffee. It tipped over, spilling a dark, steaming puddle across the table, dripping off the edge and splashing onto his boots. He didn't care. He scrambled out of his chair, dropping heavily to one knee beside the dog. "Brutus, off!" He grabbed the dog's thick collar, desperately trying to pry the animal away from Chanel. Brutus let out a low, rumbling groan. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't aggressive. It sounded like a heavy sigh escaping an ancient bellows. The dog closed his eyes, leaning harder into Chanel's lap. He completely dead-weighted himself, anchoring her chair to the floor with his body mass. The man froze. His hand remained on the dog's neck, but he stopped pulling. He looked up at Chanel, his pale eyes wide, fractured with a sudden, devastating vulnerability. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The tough, untouchable aura had shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, exhausted man kneeling in a puddle of spilled coffee. He won't move," he whispered, staring at his dog in pure disbelief. Chanel looked down at the animal in her lap. The cynical, sharp-tongued defense mechanism she had honed over 4 years of condescension faltered. She slowly lowered her hand, hesitant, her fingers trembling slightly in the cool air. Her fingertips brushed the coarse fur on the back of Brutus's neck. It was rough, like wire brush bristles, yet strangely warm. The dog exhaled, a long, huffing breath that rustled the fabric of her scrub pants. The rigid tension in the animal's back unspooled, leaving him soft and pliant against her. Chanel swallowed the dry lump forming in her throat. She looked at the man on the floor, really looked at him. The tremor in his hand, the sweat on his brow, the absolute terror of losing control over the one thing he thought he could command in a civilian world that made no sense to him. "He's not hurting me," Chanel heard herself say. Her voice was much softer now. The harsh, biting edge had evaporated. "He's a medical alert K9. The man managed to choke out. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal push-wheel of her chair, hiding his face from the staring room. His broad shoulders hitched. He detects neurological spikes, heart rates, panic." Chanel looked around the frozen cafeteria. Everyone was still staring. The orderly, the nurses, the doctors. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the dog to bite, or for the man to scream. She looked back down at the heavy head resting on her thighs, anchoring her to the present moment. Then she looked at the kneeling, broken man who was trying so hard to hold his reality together. "Whose panic?" Chanel asked quietly, the sounds of the cafeteria fading away. "Mine or yours?" He didn't answer. He just squeezed his eyes shut as a single, treacherous tear carved a clean line down his dust-caked cheek. Brutus whined softly and shifted closer, pressing his warm body against Chanel's cold metal chair, bridging the terrifying gap between two people who had built walls entirely too high to climb. People in the cafeteria were still staring. The collective gaze of 30 strangers felt like physical pressure, a hot, prickly weight pressing down on the back of Chanel's neck. She despised it. For 4 years, she had meticulously built an impenetrable armor of sharp sarcasm and deliberate isolation to keep these exact looks at bay. The tilted heads, the widened, sympathetic eyes. It made her stomach churn with a sour, metallic acidity. But as she looked down at the massive, scarred Belgian Malinois pinning her legs to the footplates, and then up at the giant of a man kneeling in a spreading puddle of dark roast coffee, her armor cracked. Thaxton was drowning in plain sight, his broad chest hitched in a fractured, erratic rhythm. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast deep, bruised shadows in the hollows of his cheeks, highlighting the fine tremor radiating through his jaw. He was a man trained to survive the most hostile environments on Earth, currently being dismantled by the ambient noise of a hospital cafeteria and the smell of boiled carrots. Chanel knew what a nervous system in freefall looked like. She saw it in the acute care ward every day. She knew it from the inside out, remembering the cold, sterile ceiling tiles of the ICU when the doctor told her she would never walk again. Panic is a thief. It steals the air from your lungs and the ground from under your feet, leaving you suspended in a terrifying, weightless void. Chanel shifted her focus away from the staring crowd and locked her eyes onto Thaxton. She dropped the cynical defense mechanisms. She engaged the clinical, steady presence that made her an exceptional nurse. "Hey," she said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the room like a scalpel. Thaxton flinched, his pale eyes snapping to her face. They were dilated, unseeing, trapped in some unseen theater of war. "Look at me," Chanel commanded, leaning forward slightly against the heavy, warm mass of Brutus's head. "Not the room, not the dog. Look at my face." It took a second, but his gaze finally anchored on her dark, brown eyes. "Inhale for 4 seconds," she instructed, her tone devoid of any pity or coddling. It was an order, flat and uncompromising. "Do it now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it." Thaxton's throat worked convulsively. He pulled in a ragged, whistling breath, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the edge of her table for stability. He smelled intensely of wet canvas, stale adrenaline, and the sharp, coppery tang of pure fear. Exhale for 4. Push it out. Chanel counted, her fingers unconsciously stroking the coarse, wiry fur behind Brutus's ears. The dog groaned, a deep, resonant vibration that buzzed through Chanel's paralyzed thighs, grounding her in the physical space. They did it 3 more times. Box breathing. Tactical, mechanical, biological control. With each cycle, the rigid, terrifying tension in Thaxton's shoulders began to unspool. The violent tremor in his hands downshifted into a dull shake. The cafeteria remained dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the plate glass windows. "Okay," Chanel said softly, assessing the return of color to his ashen face. "You're back." Thaxton blinked, the aggressive, hyper-vigilant fog receding, leaving behind a devastating raw exhaustion. He looked down at his soaked boots, then at the spilled coffee, and finally at his service dog, who was still draped across a stranger's lap. A deep, agonizing flush of humiliation crept up his neck. "I'm sorry." His voice was a broken rasp. He reached for the dog's harness again. "I'll get him off. I'm so sorry." "Stop pulling him!" Chanel snapped, though not unkindly. "He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. You're just looking at the wrong end of the leash." Thaxton froze, his hand hovering over the heavy nylon handle. "He didn't come to me because I was panicking," Chanel stating the uncomfortable truth with brutal efficiency. "He came to me because he needed heavy, immovable pressure, and my chair is a 70-pound anchor. He's trying to ground you, buddy. He just used my lap to do it." The realization hit Thaxton like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, his breath catching. The absolute certainty that he was the broken one, the liability, settled over him in a suffocating wave. Chanel didn't give him time to spiral. She grabbed the aluminum push rims of her wheels. "We're leaving," she announced. She shot a withering glare over her shoulder at the orderly, who was still clutching his cart of dirty trays like a shield. "Clean up the spill, David, and stop staring. It's a puddle, not a crime scene." David scrambled to grab a mop, his rubber soles squeaking loudly in retreat. Chanel looked back at Thaxton, who was slowly, painfully rising to his feet. His right knee popped loudly, a sickening wet crunch of cartilage and bone. He favored the leg heavily, leaning against the cold cinder-block wall. "Grab the leash," Chanel instructed. "Don't pull, just hold it. Walk on my right side." She didn't wait for him to agree. She pushed off, rolling towards the double doors. Brutus immediately stood, shaking off the tension in a violent ripple of dark fawn fur, and fell into a perfect, disciplined heel right beside her right wheel. He didn't look back at Thaxton. He stayed tethered to Chanel, a physical bridge between the shattered veteran and the paralyzed nurse. Thaxton followed. He moved with a heavy, punishing limp, his wet boots leaving dark, sluggish footprints on the grey linoleum. They pushed through the swinging doors, leaving the suffocating heat and the burning stairs of the cafeteria behind. The East Wing corridor was abandoned. Slated for renovation, the hallway was stripped of the usual hospital cheer. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige, and the air smelled heavily of industrial floor wax, drywall dust, and old, stagnant air conditioning. The fluorescent tubes above them flickered erratically, casting long, disjointed shadows that stretched and warped against the vinyl floor tiles. Chanel stopped her chair near a bank of frosted windows that overlooked an empty courtyard. The rain hammered against the glass, a chaotic, relentless drumming that effectively masked the silence between them. Thaxton slumped against the wide marble window ledge. He didn't sit. He merely leaned his considerable weight against the stone, staring out at the grey, weeping sky. He looked entirely hollowed out, a massive structure whose internal load-bearing walls had quietly collapsed. Brutus finally broke his hold on Chanel. The dog took 2 steps toward Thaxton, sniffed the damp cuff of his olive-drab jacket, and then circled twice before dropping heavily onto the cold floor. He lay perfectly positioned between Chanel's front casters and Thaxton's boots, resting his broad, scarred chin flat against the floor tiles. "His name is Brutus," Thaxton said to the glass. His voice was flat, stripped of the gravelly edge, leaving behind a quiet, profound weariness. "Suits him," Chanel replied, keeping her hands loosely resting on her push rims. She noticed the way the cold air from the window seeped into her bones. She adjusted the hem of her scrub top. "He's built like a tank. He was an explosive detection K9. 3 tours." Thaxton rubbed his hand aggressively over his face, a sandpaper sound of rough calluses scraping against a 3-day stubble. "He took a piece of shrapnel to the ribs in Kandahar. Retired him. They were going to put him down. Deemed him unadoptable because of behavioral quirks." "He likes to pin people to wheelchairs?" Chanel asked, a dry, dark humor lacing her tone. A ghost of a smile, fragile and instantaneous, flickered across Thaxton's mouth before vanishing. "No, he developed severe separation anxiety, which is ironic considering I got him to help with my own." Chanel watched the rise and fall of the dog's ribcage. The ragged, hairless scar tissue stood out starkly against the dark fur. 2 broken soldiers clinging to each other in the dark. "I thought I had it under control," Thaxton murmured, tipping his head back to rest against the cold window pane. He closed his eyes. "I haven't had an episode like that in a long time. The cafeteria, the noise, the smell of the chemicals, it caught me." He opened his eyes and looked at Chanel. The vulnerability in his pale gaze was staggering. He wasn't hiding behind anger or stoicism anymore. He was just a man admitting he was terrifyingly out of his depth. "I couldn't feel my hands," he confessed, staring at his palms as if they belonged to someone else. "I couldn't hear anything over the ringing in my ears." And then Brutus. He broke heel. He never breaks heel. He knew I was going down, and he found the heaviest, most stable thing in the room to anchor us both to. He looked at a chair, the titanium frame, the heavy cambered wheels, the unmoving legs beneath the fabric of her scrubs. "He found you," Thaxton said quietly. Chanel felt a sudden, sharp ache in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down, refusing to let the emotions surface. She hated being the inspiration. She hated being the sturdy object. But right now, in this dusty, forgotten hallway, she didn't feel like a prop. She felt seen. "My spine got crushed 4 years ago," Chanel said. The words tasted like old pennies, familiar and bitter. "A guy in a Silverado had 5 beers at a Tuesday afternoon tailgate and ran a red light. T-boned my sedan at 60 miles an hour." Thaxton didn't offer a sympathetic grimace. He didn't tilt his head and say, "I'm so sorry." He just listened, his pale eyes locked onto her face, absorbing the facts with the grim acceptance of a man who understood random, senseless violence. "For the first 2 years, I hated everyone who could walk," Chanel admitted, the truth bleeding out in the quiet corridor. She surprised herself with the confession. She never talked about this. Not to a therapist, not to her colleagues. "I hated the doctors. I hated the physical therapists. I hated the people who looked at me like I was a tragedy. I just wanted to disappear into the wall." She looked down at Brutus. The dog opened one brown eye, looking up at her lazily before closing it again, perfectly content in the silence. "But you don't get to disappear," Chanel said, her voice hardening slightly. "You have to wake up every day, hoist yourself into a metal chair, and drag yourself through a world that isn't built for you anymore. You don't get to quit just because the parameters of the mission changed." Thaxton stared at her. The words hit him with the precision of a sniper's bullet. The parameters of the mission changed. He looked at his shaking hands. He looked at his ruined knee. He looked at the dog that was supposed to fix him, but was just as broken as he was. "How do you do it?" he asked, the question raw and desperate. "How do you just accept it?" Chanel gripped her wheels. The cold metal grounded her. "You don't," she said flatly. "Acceptance is a myth they sell you in group therapy. You don't accept it. You just figure out how to carry it. You find things that are heavier than the grief, and you anchor yourself to them." She nodded down at the massive, sleeping dog between them. "Brutus gets it," she added, a faint, cynical smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "When the floor drops out, you don't panic. You find a 70-pound anchor, you drop your weight, and you wait for the storm to pass." Thaxton looked from the dog up to Chanel. For the first time since he walked into the cafeteria, the jagged, frantic energy completely drained out of his frame. The defensive posture relaxed. He pushed himself off the window ledge, his bad knee protesting with a dull ache, and carefully lowered himself to sit on the dusty floor right next to Brutus. He crossed his legs, leaning his broad back against the wall, putting himself at eye level with Chanel's footplates. He rested a large, calloused hand on the dog's flank. Brutus sighed, shifting his weight to lean firmly against Thaxton's thigh, while keeping his front paws securely resting against Chanel's chair. Connected. Grounded. "I'm Thaxton," he said, holding his free hand out toward her. It was still bruised, the knuckles scarred, but the violent tremor had finally ceased. Chanel looked at the offered hand. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a bridge built across a terrifying expanse of shared trauma. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around his rough, warm palm. The grip was firm, solid, and deeply human. "Chanel," she replied. Outside, the November rain continued to batter the frosted glass, a relentless, freezing downpour. But inside the sterile, dusty corridor, the air felt a fraction warmer. The deafening roar of the world had quieted, reduced to the steady, rhythmic breathing of a scarred K9 and the quiet solidarity of two people who had finally stopped trying to survive alone. What did you think of Chanel and Thaxton's unexpected encounter? Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are brought down by the quiet intuition of a loyal friend. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of human connection, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, emotional stories. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where an animal knew exactly what you needed?